Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I tackled this water droplet. Now I will just quickly mention, as you can see in the finished photo in the corner, there are 3 water droplets there. I did this as a series on my Patreon channel. I was asked by a member to do a tutorial on water droplets, and what I wanted to do is actually pick a few different instances where the water droplets would be a completely different shape, so that members would be able to apply those different techniques to maybe some pet portraits they're working on, or a scenario where a water droplet might require, as you can see, a slightly different position. This one here is on a blade of grass, the middle one is more what would be on a flower petal, and the one to the right, the third one, is actually a droplet that is hanging down, and in this case it was on a piece of fruit, but this might be maybe a stick if you've got a dog swimming in water, for instance. So I wanted to make sure that I could try and cover as many scenarios as I could in one tutorial. So if you would like to see this water droplet and all 3 of them, they're available over on my Patreon channel now. I did them all with a live voiceover, and they're also listed on my website on my Patreon library, where I do have a full list of tutorial thumbnails so that you can see the kind of content that I've got on my Patreon channel. I'll link all of that in the description below. Now, regardless of what shape droplet you're going to be working on, the biggest thing to remember is the contrast. I speak about it a lot in every single tutorial, but you want to get your highlights as bright as they need to be and your shadows as dark as they need to be. Now, the other thing to consider as well is that obviously the water droplet is going to be very translucent, so it's going to pick up highlights and shadows from what is in the surroundings. There may actually also be some objects reflecting within that droplet, so we want to make sure that we pay really close attention to the reference photo. Now, during this clip here, you're going to see that I've got some of these pencils that I'm showing up towards the camera. Obviously, as I say, this is done as a live voiceover, so I'm explaining the colour choices that I'm using. Now, with this tutorial specifically, I was finding I couldn't get the exact green within the set that I had. So what I had to do is I had to mix various layers, different colours, in order to get the sort of saturation that I was after. Because I only use the light fast colours within the sets, it does limit to a degree the colours that I've got in front of me, but with pastels it's very much like working with a paint, that you can mix the various layers to get that colour that you're after. Now with this, I did start with a mid-tone colour. I didn't go as dark as I needed right from the very beginning, and that was because I wanted to make sure I maintained those reflections, those nice highlights, the little lime green areas that you can see here. I was really wanting to make sure that I didn't go too dark to start with. There are some instances where yes, you would be predominantly working from dark to light, but again, in the other aspect, there is also instances where you would want to do the reverse. If you have an area where you don't want that colour contaminated and you don't want it to create a bit more of that muddier colour, you want to be working from light to dark. Now that is the good thing with pastels, they are such a versatile medium and we can do that very easily. And you saw here that I was able to layer that dark on top of the light in the top section of the droplet, because I knew that this was the darkest part where I'm going to get the most contrast. Now at the moment, this, although it does start to look like a water droplet, we need to work through that ugly stage. I will continue to layer my lights on top of my darks now that I do have that darker base foundation in place, and it is just a matter of really studying that reference photo to put in those highlights and those reflections. So if you imagine this is, as you know, on a blade of grass, this is going to be reflecting the image that is behind it. So at the moment, to us, it may not make sense. But when you're incorporating this in with a pet portrait, obviously it all becomes to then tie together. However, because light can bounce through various ways, it can be reflected off many different objects, we want to be making sure that we've got the shape of the droplet accurate, along with the reflections within it as well. It is the most important thing. Now when we're working on droplets, it's very similar to how I would also tackle metalwork on a dog collar, for instance. The lights and the contrast is crucial. If I don't get these highlights as bright as they need to be, this water droplet is not going to look wet. And that's why you saw me put in the white at the very beginning, to make sure that I got that as bright as I needed it to be. What I wouldn't want to do in this instance is put my greens down first and then try and put the white on top. Because although with pastel pencils they do show up beautifully over your darker colours, it's potentially not going to be as pure white as it would if we just used that white from the very beginning. And also, if you are incorporating water droplets within a pet portrait, they are going to be all different. They're going to be reflecting very differently from, one droplet to another. So really study that reference photo. That will tell you where your highlights need to be, the shape of that droplet and what is being reflected through it. What I'll do as well is at the end of this video is I'll put just a larger version of the finished droplet here, just of this one, so that you can see that up close. But what I'm always wanting to do is keep my pencil details on that curve. I want to follow the shape of that water droplet throughout. Now obviously I've got that bright green highlight in the middle, but that is reflecting that blade of grass, so that's going to be an exception. But the rest of them, there are no straight lines within this. Now regardless of what we're drawing with nature, trees, grass, fur, anything like that, there are no straight lines. So we want to make sure that to a degree everything has a slight curvature about it. Now if I was to make my lines within this droplet too straight, I'm not going to be following the perspective correctly. I want to make sure that I capture that 3D, that globe effect, to make it look like this droplet is coming out of the paper. Now obviously something to consider is if you are incorporating droplets into a pet portrait, a swimming dog for instance, these droplets are not going to be as big as what I'm working on here. So we're only going to be able to add as much detail as we can. We have to be realistic. But the main thing that is important is putting in that highlight, the top and the bottom, the shadow. Most of the time they will have that same similar sort of structure, so we want to make sure however small those water droplets are within that portrait that they do still follow that same rule, if that applies, which as I say most of the time it will. And what I would be looking to do is if these droplets were considerably smaller on the portrait, as I've mentioned, I'll be putting in the highlight, the shadow, and then potentially that really bright green highlight in the middle. The rest of these little details that I'm adding now, you may not have that room to fit that in, but as long as we've got those main sets of contrast in place, that's going to be what's making that droplet within that portrait that much more realistic. So what I've got as well is the Chinese White by Caran. I save that till my last layers because I find it's the softest, most opaque lead. So it means that I'm always able to go one shade brighter should I need to. So you can see here that I've saved that till the very last highlights to make sure that I can get it as crisp and as bright as I possibly can. And going back to what I was just mentioning about the ratio of the size of the droplet compared to the pet portrait that you might be working on, or flower maybe. If you look at the droplets here on the blade of grass, they are very small, but what I have done, as I've mentioned, is put in where those main sets of highlights are, a little bit of that bluer colour in the middle to show that reflection from the sky. But as long as I've put in the general shape with those highlights, and that's what I'm indicating at, you can see that it does tie the whole main droplet together on that blade of grass. Now as you can see from this process, it has taken quite a few layers in order to build up this kind of reflection. One of the most common questions that I'm asked is regarding a fixative when the tooth of the paper has been filled. Now I personally don't use fixatives, but I don't also like throwing artwork away, so if you have come to the point where you filled the tooth of the paper, a workable fixative can work really well in order to put some of that tooth back. Now it is worth bearing in mind that they will cause a slight colour shift. Sometimes it's not just slight, depending on the fixative that you use, and your whites can often go a bit dull, a bit grey. However, because you're using it as a workable fixative rather than the last fixative at the end, it doesn't matter because you will be applying future layers on top and adjusting that colour back to how you want. And I'm no expert with fixatives at all, I've only tried a couple, but I did find the Spectrafix was one that caused less colour shift than the others, but as I say, it did still occur, just not as severe. The one biggest tip if you are using a fixative that I would recommend is to use a fine mist sprayer bottle to avoid getting those heavy droplets on your artwork. Now if you are going down the route of a fixative, the biggest tip that I can say is don't spray too close to your artwork. That's a big mistake. You don't want to apply too much of that fixative too quickly. Apply light layers and also get a fine mist sprayer bottle. That will reduce the amount of larger, heavier droplets of fixative that will get left on your artwork, which can be a real nuisance to get rid of. And as I say, work in light layers. You are much better off doing 2 or 3 lighter layers than one heavier layer. What I did when I first used a fixative is too much of a heavier layer was applied and it just almost dissolved all of the details and my portrait vanished. So I do like having these little additional elements, these little tutorials on my Patreon channel, but predominantly it does focus on fur types, different breeds, pet portraits, and I've also got a range of wildlife subjects over there as well. My aim with my Patreon channel is to try and help anybody that's looking to do pet portraits. So that's where my main focus is, and as I say, then just putting in some of my wildlife tutorials as well in there. So if you think that is of interest, as I say, I'll link all of that in the description below, and if you've got any questions at all, feel free to message me over on any of my social medias or in the comments below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So thank you very much for watching. There was the close-up, and here is the 3 droplets that I've finished. So if this video was of use, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up, because it really does help. And don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell button, and you'll get notified of future content.